Most respected Rajawachan, your brothers and sisters. Today's gospel reading was taken from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 3. And it's a very familiar passage to us because it is one that we read at every baptism. And you'll notice that it is the account where Nicodemus, who was one of the Pharisees, goes to Christ secretly, and he really wants to ask him how it is that how do you enter the kingdom? What do you need to do? All these things, right? He wants to go seeking wisdom from Christ. So he goes to Christ and he does that, and it's a very interesting conversation between them. Again, we don't need to get into it because many of us are familiar with it, but the basic idea is that he says to Nicodemus, Christ says, you must be born again. And this idea of being born again was very confusing to him. And he says, how can someone be born again? How do you... Because remember, at this time, the terminology of baptism, the way that we understand baptism at this time, though it was considered more as a ritual washing. Because John the Baptist had a baptism as well. Before John the Baptist, there was even a type of baptism that was practiced by the Jews, and that was more of a ritualistic cleansing. So it's just a cleansing. They didn't see it as a baptism of rebirth and regeneration. Because for us, if you ever come to a baptism service and you listen as the child is placed into the water, it specifically says that for rebirth and regeneration, this person is baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so for us, the baptism for us, it is a rebirth. But we always say, every baptism, I even say the child that goes into the baptismal font, when they come out of the baptismal font, it's a different person. And intellectually, you look at that kid, you look at that child that went into the baptismal font and come out, and they're like, it still looks like the same baby, still cries the same, still sounds the same, looks the same. It still looks like a baby. How is this baby a new creation, a new existence when it comes out of the baptismal waters? And that's the same type of thinking that's confusing to Nicodemus. And it's very important for us to really look at what Christ even says to him. He uses this example, and he says, it's not that we're talking about being born in the flesh. What type of a rebirth is it? Is it birth of the Spirit? Very good. It's birth of the Spirit. And so here he says, those who are born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you that you must be born again. And he says, how can these things be? And Christ gave him this example of the wind blowing where it wants to blow. And he says to him even, are you the teacher of Israel? Because he's one of the Pharisees, right? He's one of the teachers, one of the people who are supposed to search the scriptures. We're supposed to be well aware of the scriptures that came before, well aware of the teachings and all that of the church. And yet he doesn't understand these things. And he says, are you the teacher of Israel and do not know these things? Most assuredly I say to you, we speak that we know, what we know, and we testify to what we have seen, and you do not receive our witness. If I have told you the earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you the heavenly things? St. John Chrysostom actually looked at this particular passage and he said, it's not, because the language that Christ uses right here is not, if you listen very carefully, he says, if I tell you of earthly things and you don't believe, how are you then going to believe if I tell you about heavenly things? But this whole conversation between Nicodemus and Christ didn't start off as a question of belief. Because he believed. He believed, didn't he? What did he say when he went to Christ? How was his greeting? Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher. Come from where? Or come from whom? God. For no one can do these things that you do unless God is with him. So he comes to Christ knowing who he is, calling him Rabbi, saying, I know that you are from God. So he's already acknowledging that Christ is heavenly. And Christ even says, if I tell you these earthly things and you don't believe me, how are you going to believe when I tell you heavenly things? He says, we speak of what we speak of what we know, and we testify to what we see. Because Christ is even then acknowledging Nicodemus' his greeting by saying, Nicodemus acknowledges Christ is from on high. Christ is coming down from heaven to earth. So Christ is then aware of these spiritual things, of these heavenly things. And he says, I speak of what I've seen and what I know. And that's what I testify to. So Christ is already explaining to us all these things that are of a spiritual nature. But though Nicodemus, like many of us, don't have the ability sometimes to comprehend what Christ is talking about, because our minds are small. We like to think that we're great, but our minds are truly small. If you listen to the epistle reading that was read here, he said that you must be like infants. We are like infants. We are like spiritual infants. Yet we are spiritual infants that receive this milk, that receive this nourishment, this spiritual nourishment. And if you've ever seen a baby feeding, you understand, right? How do babies feed? Do you have to teach them? No. Does anyone have to actually go and say, okay, this is how you drink milk? You have to suckle, you have to swallow, you have to teach a baby that? No. The most amazing thing to see is a newborn child that can already start to suckle by itself without having any training. It's like you train them. We train our kids when they get older, right? How to eat with their hands, how to use a knife and fork, how to chew enough times. We're still working with, I'm not saying this person's name, this hypothetical child that may or may not be mine, working with her about making sure that when she eats that, this palm of her hand isn't dirty. Did your parents ever teach you that? When I was growing up, my parents told me if you're eating with your hands, you can't get any chor or curry or anything on your palm, right? That's the sign of you're eating, when they eat. You're not supposed to do that, right? You're supposed to use your fingertips to eat. So you get trained how to eat. Something as simple as eating chor and curry or something, you get trained about that, right? But for a young child, there's no training required. They know automatically how to drink milk. There's something that's that they're born with. It's a natural ability. And one of the most distressing things is that when some children were born who are unable to suckle properly, and then they have to go through some exercise and do all that stuff. But vast majority of us when we're born, we naturally know how to receive the milk from our mothers. And so that's what he's saying here. There's no understanding that needs to happen. In the epistle here that was read, he was saying, like infants, receive that milk, receive that nourishment from God in this case. Because there's no understanding, there's no training that needs to happen. You receive it from on high, and you receive it gladly and joyfully. And in that same case here, he's almost scolding Nicodemus, because Nicodemus comes to him as one who's supposed to be learned, one who's a teacher, one who should have all this knowledge, and all of that knowledge and all of that intellectual ability is wasted here. Because he's showing us it's not about those who are knowledgeable, those who have all this information. All that wisdom and knowledge and information and intelligence of this world is meaningless in God. Because for God doesn't seek that. God seeks purity. God seeks those who are faithful, those who are willing and ready to accept his teaching as a child receives milk from his mother. And he says here, because he comes to him with a lack of understanding, but what is the words that he even says here? He says, most assuredly, if I've told you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? He went from this understanding of knowledge, of intellect, of trying to understand something, to Christ scolding him for having unbelief. Because Christ is specifically trying to show us that it's not about knowledge. It's not about intellect. It's not about who knows how much. Because he's learned. He's well-read. He's a Pharisee. He's a teacher of his people. And Christ is saying all that doesn't matter. The question is, do you believe? Because all the knowledge of the world is not going to get you into the kingdom. Knowledge is a tool, like anything else. And St. John Chrysostom, when he made his commentary on this particular chapter, he said, Nicodemus tried to use reasoning and understanding, and Christ is telling him, you specifically cannot do that. Because he's acknowledging, he knows intellectually that Christ came from God, that Christ came from on high. When Christ is telling him about baptism and rebirth and being born of the Spirit, this misunderstanding is there. This almost like a fear, maybe it's a disbelief or something, but Christ says you're not believing. Don't look with the eyes of your mind, but look with the eyes of your heart. And so that's what is required of us. And John Chrysostom says that we cannot enter the kingdom, no amount of human reasoning is going to allow us to enter the kingdom. No amount of human reasoning is going to help us to have a relationship with God. Because you cannot reason your way to a relationship with God. Over-rationalization has that problem. We become too legalistic, or we become looking for all these different examples, or all these different signs and all these different things, rather than just accepting the testimony that's already been given to us. What other testimony do we really need, except for when Christ here says, we have seen and we testify to that. We speak about what we know. So Christ has already seen, Christ already knows, and he is sharing that knowledge with us to some extent, although we cannot ever fully understand his full revelation. But what he's sharing with us, we are to accept, as this child accepts its nourishment from its mother. Not to seek understanding of it, not to try to nitpick, not to try to look for even loopholes or this and that. It's not about any of those things. We accept the teaching that is handed to us. And St. Paul even talks about that in his epistle. He says, we don't preach and teach these things of our own. We give you these things that have been handed down to us. What he received from Christ, he gives to the people. And what his successors receive from him, they then give to the next generation. None of us teaches of our own, but it all comes from one source. It was handed down to us, but where does it all ultimately come from? As Nicodemus very wisely said, you are from God. You are from God. And no one can do these things unless God is with it. So when Christ is saying it, it is our desire, it is our hope, it is our expectation, it is our joy to receive it in the same way as when that infant receives milk or receives any kind of nourishment, they're excited and they're happy for it. In the same way, we also receive the spiritual nourishment from God happily. All praise, glory, and thanksgiving to the Blessed Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and always and forever and ever. Amen.